I'm Mike Belcito, co-founder of eFuneral, and I want to talk for a few minutes about caskets and coffins. Now, what's the difference between a casket and coffin? Well, actually, it's a little known fact that the term for what we all think of when we think about a container that we would place a body into to then eventually be buried into the ground, that's actually a coffin. Now, a casket is, at least a long time ago, it was really, that was the term that was referred to essentially a box, oftentimes a jewelry box, but usually it was for a box that not quite as big as a chest, but larger than the average box, so somewhere in between. It really wasn't necessarily used, at least that term wasn't used for the container that we place a body in when during an actual funeral service. So again, that's a coffin, but what happened is over time, those individuals within the funeral profession, undertakers, funeral directors, they use the term casket so much that now those two terms, coffin and casket, are pretty much interchangeable. And in fact, I'd argue that most people use the term casket today to talk about what we're all thinking about when we think of that container that a body is placed into to then get buried into the ground. But speaking of getting buried into the ground, it's interesting to note, oftentimes caskets or coffins, they could be used in a number of scenarios, not just necessarily when somebody's buried into the ground. First of all, when that does happen, a casket can go directly into the ground, or it could go into what's known as a burial vault or an outer burial container. That's essentially another container that the casket goes into. It doesn't protect the casket, but what it does is it holds the ground up, so the ground in the cemetery doesn't sink. These days in North America, most cemeteries require that a casket actually be placed in an outer burial container. It's not legally required, but it does. I think sometimes laws would vary state by state, but most cemeteries do require that. But aside from going into the ground, a casket could be placed in a mausoleum, where it will go into a building essentially and go into the wall where anybody can come into that mausoleum and visit and essentially respect their loved one who's essentially buried in that mausoleum. The other place that a casket could go is actually into a crematory. So some people don't realize individuals who are cremated, they're cremated in what's known as a cremation casket, or at least they can be. Now, an individual can absolutely have a public visitation with a viewing of the body in a funeral service, and that viewing, the body's going to be in the casket. So people don't realize, sometimes when you're going to a funeral service or a wake or what have you, and the body's present in a casket, that family may have elected for the body to then be cremated, and so it would actually go into a cremation casket. Now, in terms of what the casket actually does, now we all know casket protects the body. However, it doesn't preserve the body, and sometimes that's a point of confusion. Now, manufacturers of caskets can certainly offer all types of warranties, and indeed they do, but the warranties that they offer are more about the structural integrity of the casket, of that coffin, not whether or not it will actually preserve the body. There's nothing that can actually preserve a body over a long-term period of time. So that's something to keep in mind. That's something that a casket doesn't do. In terms of the type of materials that a casket can be made of, it ranges. There are certainly all types of metals, from steel to fiberglass, and certainly different types of woods that can be used. So mahogany, which is something that's very elegant, very high end, and then there's pine, and that's something that's obviously much more simple. There's also a whole host of eco-friendly caskets that have now become available, and so some of these are literally made out of wool. Some of these are made out of more like a wicker basket type material. Now, in a future video and podcast, we'll definitely talk about the different types of materials that can be used to make a casket. That's something we'll talk about at a later time, but it can be made from a whole host of materials. In terms of how caskets are made and sold, there's several different manufacturers. There's actually a few major manufacturers that make caskets today, and those are huge companies. And what happens is those companies sell the caskets exclusively through funeral homes, most of them. So when you're actually visiting with your funeral director, they can offer you caskets that are made by some of these major manufacturers. And some of these manufacturers have been around for 100+ years, so there's certainly a lot of history there. Now, these manufacturers don't sell caskets directly to consumers. At least many of them do not. There are some that do, and something that is interesting to understand is, there's even places like Walmart and Costco that now sell caskets directly to consumers, and often these are low-price options, and in fact, federal law requires that funeral homes accept third-party caskets. So if you were to purchase a casket from Walmart or Costco, federal law requires that funeral home to accept the casket and to allow you to use it, and they can't charge you any additional fees if you decide to do that. Now, you also have to keep in mind that when you're ordering something from a Walmart or a Costco, if it comes, to the funeral home a day before the service and something's wrong, or the casket is, affected in any way, then, that might cause a whole lot of strain on your end as well. So that's something to just consider, but know that you have that right to use a casket really from pretty much anybody. So I hope that these last few minutes have been helpful in terms of getting a basic understanding of caskets and kind of where the term, caskets versus coffins, and even now, where you can purchase caskets from. I hope that's all been helpful. But we're gonna actually post a couple of videos and do a couple of podcasts later on that digs a little bit deeper so you can get an even better understanding. For more resources about different aspects of funeral planning, you can visit eFuneral.com/resources. You can also check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/eFuneralResources.